All right, Simon. Well, welcome to another session of Black History Conversations. Each week we have a different focus and discuss issues around Black history and Black heritage. And today we are welcoming Dr. Junita Cox. Really looking forward to this session. Junita is a research fellow at the University of London, focusing on the Windrush scandal and its transnational and Commonwealth context. So she's joined us today to provide us with an update on her work. So we're really looking forward to this. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment and just whoops daisy, find my introduction for Nita. Right, off we go again. Right. So I wanted especially though, Junita, before you tell us about your work with the Windrush scandal and the transnational and Commonwealth context of the work, I just wanted to say that you also set up and manage Guyana Speaks, which is a fantastic initiative. Last Sunday of each month, August and December accepted, I see, when you choose a topic that's Guyana related. And I've joined a few of your sessions and they've really been very interesting. So that's brilliant. So Junita, I'll stop sharing and I'll let you share your screen and then you'll be able to tell us about what's been going on and what you found out recently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, for inviting me to do the presentation today. I did one, can't remember how long ago, not too long ago, looking specifically at the legislation that had led up to the Windrush scandal. So I thought I'd do something quite different today. Primarily, my work is focused on collecting oral histories. So I thought I would talk really about the initial scoping project that I worked on that then led to the project we're doing now. And the scoping project was really just to see whether this longer term project was going to be viable. The project, as you've mentioned, is called the Windrush Scandal in its transnational and Commonwealth context. It's an AHRC funded project over a period of 3 years. We started looking at the project in June last year. But as I mentioned, we had a shorter 6 months project beforehand, and I'm just going to share that because I thought you might be interested in hearing some of the oral history recordings that were produced. So I'm going to go into my PowerPoint. And so the 6 month project itself was called An Oral History of the Windrush Generation and its relationship to the British state. And that was funded by the University of London's Convocation Trust. It was a 6 month project, as I've mentioned, with 3 key aims. One was to try and understand the extent to which efforts had been made to inform the Caribbean community of the implications of changing immigration legislation. And then to also get a sense of how the community had responded or reacted to that, the awareness of the changing legislation. And then the second thing was to gain a kind of broader understanding of the attitudes people held towards the state and to officialdom within the Caribbean communities. We're sort of interested in finding out how those attitudes may have prevented or inhibited members from taking steps to regularize their status. And this was really based on some of the oral history recordings that had been produced in a book by the Phillips brothers. And there were sort of comments within that where people had said, but I was born British, I'm living in Britain, I am British, what is this sort of nonsense about having to register as British? So it's sort of interesting to see the various different attitudes that had emerged from the changing legislation. And then the third thing we wanted to do was really just to understand the circumstances that had left many members of the Caribbean community without legal proof of their right to remain. So let me just go to the next page. So with the actual scoping project, I interviewed 10 people. And we tried to pick people from different islands and also from Guyana, just to see if somehow those different territories interacted with British law differently. We were aware, of course, that, you know, Jamaica and Trinidad had received their independence in 1962, but then obviously other places like Antigua were much later. I believe Antigua was 1981 or 83, I can't remember which, but certainly in the 80s. And St. Lucia, 1979. So it was just interesting to see what relationship those independent territories had then created with the British, and to see if that had any impact on their citizenship status. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that most oral history studies have really have been very male dominated, and also been very dominated by recordings from the African Caribbean community primarily. So what we wanted to do in this particular scoping project was to include people from all sorts of different heritage backgrounds. So for example, on this list, you've got Ruby Joseph, well, Elif Harwood, who was Afro-Guyanese or African Guyanese, Ansel Wong, Chinese Trinidadian, George Manga was Indo-Guyanese, you know, and then obviously a lot of people with all sorts of different mixes, but it was just to see whether there were kind of difference in attitudes, because their longer histories were different. You know, obviously if you were African Guyanese, your heritage would be traced to slavery and before that. But if you were Indo-Guyanese, for example, the experience of indentureship may have created a kind of different relationship. So we were just interested in how identities were differently shaped, as well as thinking about their relationship to the state. Of course, most of this was done during COVID-19 and the lockdown. So whereas normally with oral history, you would actually go and have one-on-one face-to-face interviews, which are, to some respect, they're kind of easier because it's easier to build up a rapport, I suppose. Yeah, I guess that's how you'd normally think of it. It's easier to create a rapport. But within lockdown, I had to do most of the recordings via Zoom. But it wasn't the kind of, I thought initially it'd be really, it would be maybe a much more negative experience than being able to do it face to face. But in actual fact, I found it was really empowering for some of the respondents, in that they had control over the interview. It just meant that, you know, if people were upset, especially I found with some of the recordings I did with men, that they were then able to control what I could see of them. They could switch their screen off, they could put their laptop, move the screen like that. So in a sense, it enabled them to kind of manage how their emotions were presented to me. But then the other issue was the poor sound quality, and it's something that I need to look at going forward, is how do you actually what new technologies are available that will enable us to improve sound recordings. And I say that because the major advantage of being able to do it over Zoom was because I was then able to interview people who were still stuck in the Caribbean, trying to get back into the UK. Whereas obviously if it had been, when the project first started, we were just going to do it with people who were based here in the UK. And I hadn't even thought about the fact that, you know, how do I reach people overseas to find out what their circumstances are? But then the other issue, of course, is that most of the people that got caught up in the Windrush scandal weren't necessarily the Windrush generation themselves. They tend to be in a much older cohort. It tended to be the children of the Windrush generation. So those young children that had traveled with their parents arriving into the UK as toddlers, 1-year-olds, babies, you know. So it was mainly that cohort that we were interviewing. Nevertheless, it meant that I guess the average age was anybody sort of over 50, more likely to be 60, maybe 70. So there was a lower familiarity with online technology, so it was quite challenging at times. I had 2 sets of different types of interviews. So I had semi-structured interviews, but just general ones, where I just wanted to get a sense of, I guess, a more typical kind of oral history recording in relationship to the Windrush generation, in terms of, you know, the process of migration here, what it was like, what documents they'd traveled with, what their expectations were, what was it like working here, housing, those kinds of things. But because it was linked to my interest in the Windrush scandal itself, I tailored the questions at the end to say, you know, did they have any issues with immigration or the Home Office? So I just wanted to play a few oral history recordings so you get a sense of what we've managed to collate so far. And this first recording here is from somebody called George Manga, who was born in Georgetown in Guyana in the 1930s. And he settled here in the UK in 1959. I thought what was interesting about his particular interview was that he echoed something I'd heard Sam King talk about. And Sam King was a Jamaican who had said that even before coming to the UK, so Sam King had fought, had been in the RAF in the UK, he had gone back to Jamaica for a very short period, decided that he was going to return, and he returned on the Empire Windrush. But one of the things that Sam King had noted was that whilst he was in Jamaica, he had to get a piece of documentation from the Justice of the Peace saying he was a person of good character. And then, so I became interested in this idea that, you know, the 1948 Nationality Act was saying that, you know, people who were citizens, the British subjects were people who were citizens of the United Kingdom and the colonies and the Commonwealth. And so I sort of thought, well, that just meant they could come and go pretty much as they pleased, because, you know, if everybody has an equal right to British citizenship, then, you know, there's no kind of barrier to traveling. But so it was really interesting to note that a lot of people actually were, in a sense, barred from entry if they weren't considered to have good character. Now, it's difficult to say, you know, how thorough that kind of process or the checking process was of that, but essentially they needed police clearance. So I'm hoping, actually, do you know what? I've made an error, so I'm just going to stop this for 1 second and come out, because I think when I share, I need to make sure I share sound. So I'm going back in again. So it should work now. So this is a recording of George Manga. George Manga.
But there was one thing else that we had to do coming to England. You see, people don't realize racism is not something new, right? We had to get something called a police clearance to come to England. I have mine still. You had to go to the police headquarters. Although I was a police officer, I went to police headquarters, and with a picture and a thumbprint and everything, you had to put on this thing, and you brought that to England with you, with your passport. We had to have vaccination certificates, yellow fever, smallpox, everything under the sun. You had to have all that done. Typhoid, you had all that done. And then it was always recommended that you get a letter of reference about your character. And because I came from a family that had lots of influences and things, and we were mixed with certain people, I got mine from a doctor and a lawyer and various people, a judge wrote mine. So we had that, but they never asked to see it when we arrived here, but we told there that you must have it to come to England. Right? I think it was a way of trying to say to people, if you misbehave when you're younger, don't bother to go, sort of thing. It was that sort of thing. That's how I think now. But then I never thought of it then. No.
Okay, so that was George Manga. And then another lady that I'd interviewed was Elif Harwood. She had also been born in Georgetown in the 1930s, and she'd moved to the UK in 1965 to train as a nurse, and actually had planned to settle in the UK. But I think following the death of her children, she had left her children actually with her husband while she was training. So when she'd heard of her husband's, the passing of her husband, she had to return to Guyana. And she made some interesting comments about her return. In actual fact, I was so confused because this was at the beginning of the project before I understood any of the legislation. And so you'll hear me kind of thinking I've understood what and then not understanding, and and that's kind of how it went on until I eventually understood. Well, anyway, you listen to it and then I'll comment on that again.
Returnees, I went back and only to find I was neither fish nor fowl. I'd gone back and said, can I have a job? And then you have this kind of veiled threat is you come back from England to take us over. You have become anglicized. We have to protect this anglification, if that is a word. And because I had now lost, there were also economic things. I had lost the house I left. My children were found out. I needed to pull things together. I couldn't get a job in Guyana. I could not. I tried in 2 hospitals. No, they were not recruiting at that time. So that's how I returned. Only to find that when I got back to Southampton, I could not enter. So I think what may have saved me is that on my person was my badge of state registration. So I was given a 12-month stay. You may stay for 12 months. To my whatever, I still have that passport that states that you may stay.
What passport did you travel on? Was it a Guyanese?
Yes, British
passport?
Guyana.
So they gave you a stamp that allowed you to stay. 12 months to stay.
For 12 months. So that was better than nothing. So I came in for 12 months.
But, may I ask you initially, when you came the first time in 65, what passport did you travel on then?
It's the same.
Oh, the same Guyanese passport. So it wasn't a British passport?
It was called British Guyana.
I see. Oh, okay. So it wasn't...
Guyana was not called Guyana.
Mm-hmm. So it was a Commonwealth passport?
No, British Guyana.
British Guyana, okay.
It was called British Guyana. Mm-hmm. And Guyana was spelled with an I at the time.
Right.
So it was called British Guyana. So, and then that passport was without limit of time.
Yes. So when you came in again in 68...
Yes.
What reason did they give for not allowing you back in? Because presumably you were British then.
Well, they said, what I understood is that the passport was no longer valid.
Okay, because Guyana had become independent by
yes.
then. Okay.
the passport was no longer valid. And therefore, I had a 12-month stay, which I had not thought about. It never occurred to me that I could not return. Because, I mean, there were other goings on. I had children, I had to earn a living, I had the responsibility of bringing up my boys. I never thought that having been in England on this passport, that it had now been revoked. So I came back in and...
So you hadn't heard of anything relating to that if the country became independent, that affected...
No, because it must have become independent after when I was here.
That's right, yes, in 66.
Yes.
So, okay, so then, I mean, what did you do after that in terms of your stay? If you stayed longer than a year, were you able to change your status?
I wrote the Home Office demanding an explanation. I must have been going on a political search. I wrote the Home Office to ask, why was my status changed when my original status did not indicate that? And I don't have that reply, but the letter was that I must decide to revoke Guyanese nationality should I want to take up British nationality, which I did.
So I thought that was a really interesting recording with Elif, because it was something that kept coming up time and time again with different people I've spoken to. You know, if you have a passport that says without limit of time and nobody says anything to you about changes of legislation, or that on independence you're going to lose your right to British citizenship, why would you even know? You know, you just wouldn't know. And as she said, she was very busy with life, you know, like all of us. So and then the next person I interviewed was somebody called Ruby Joseph, who was from Grenada, and she had lived there with her grandmother. She hadn't arrived into the UK until I think 1962, when she moved in with her mother and the rest of her family, her siblings. And she had traveled abroad on a school trip without any problems. And then what we see later on through the interview is that it wasn't until 1982 that she encountered a problem with her citizenship status. So this section here just kind of explains or tells you what she says. So
when I set about applying for a passport, age 22, and age 22, there was a problem that, oh, you're not British anymore. And this was quite shocking. You can't have a British passport because you're not British anymore. You're now Grenadian because Grenada has become independent.
Yeah, so again, the theme of people being shocked, of course, it came up a lot. And so that's just a sample of some of the interviews I did, the sort of more general interviews. But that led me to think more about, you know, what sort of questions do I need to be asking people to really get to the meat of the problem. So, you know, I asked people what their status was on arrival, if they could remember a time when the government called for people to register as British. Now, apparently there was a situation whereby you could have a passport that said you were British but had been issued in the Caribbean, but that had a completely different status to a passport if it had been issued in the UK. So if you actually wanted to avoid the situation where your island became independent and then you lost your citizenship, you could actually register as British. So some people were aware, some people did that, a lot of people didn't. So then, you know, I was asking people when they first realized they had a problem, how did they go about solving it? who did they get to solve the situation? Clearly, when we look at the Windrush scandal, there's kind of a dereliction of responsibility on the part of the government. So, and you know, legal aid, I discovered later on, wasn't actually available to a lot of people because of changes in the legal aid in an act that was passed in 2012. So it's trying to understand, you know, how the community rallied together to support each other. I was also interested in what the impact of that was on family life. And then following the implementation of the Windrush Task Force, what citizenship they were then granted, and then, you know, how people kind of would describe their sense of identity, you know, how they felt after having gone through this awful process. So this is a recording I did with Anthony Brown. And I think he was one of the first people that I did an interview with where I thought, hang on a minute, the Windrush scandal in the project, in terms of its transnational and Commonwealth context, had to be much more expansive. It couldn't just be about looking at the Windrush scandal, which really marked it as being from about 2013, you know, with Theresa May, that sort of period going forward. And clearly there's kind of a long history of deportations, repatriations going on prior to that period. And this section here sort of captures that. So, as I say, Anthony was born in Jamaica in the 1960s. He moved to the UK with his mother and siblings in 67 to join his father. Now, his father had been settled in the UK since the 1950s. And then I guess because of the different issues, the different problems that were going on within British society, his family decided that he should have a period of education in Jamaica. So he was in Jamaica for a period of 3 years, attending Jamaica College. He returned to the UK in 1976, just briefly for a wedding. Yeah, so you see he's kind of going backwards and forwards a bit. And this section that I'm going to play now talks about what happened on his return from Jamaica.
And wanted to go to university, and they said that I was being treated as an overseas student. So I said, overseas student? Well, I'm British. So I wrote to the Home Office, and the Home Office said that, yeah, I'm an overseas student. Because I'd been out of the country for more than 2 years, I'd fallen foul of the 1971 Immigration Act, which says that if you've been out of the country for more than 2 years, you lose your right to remain. So they said I needed to report to Manchester Airport to be deported. So that's when the shock hit, and was really, really frightened. Didn't know what to do. Because while I was in Jamaica, I'd always pined to come back again. Because I missed my friends, missed my brothers, missed England. And now I was going to get deported.
So in Anthony's particular situation, he was really fortunate in that he met some really strong activists. I believe somebody who's now called Professor Gus John, somebody called Beresford Edwards, a few people who were based in the Manchester area who were keen activists and realized that this sort of thing was going on, and they managed to basically stop him from being deported. But it then meant that his status was that he was Jamaican, but he had indefinite leave to remain. And that in itself causes lots of problems, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But thankfully for him, he was then able to have his British citizen restored in full. So, and I'll explain why I say in full a bit later on. This recording, gosh, now, so this was, Richard Black was born in St. Lucia, and he had moved to the UK to join his parents in 1960. So this is before the 1962 Immigration Act, and which started sort of curtailing the movement of people from the Caribbean into Britain. But he had attended both primary and secondary school here in the UK. He went on to become a photographer. And then in 1976, he married a woman who was from Trinidad. And so, you know, because they were going backwards and forwards, visiting her parents, he applied for and was issued with a new 10-year British passport. And so that passport was applied for in the UK in July, so on the 13th of July, 1978. So, and I'm just emphasizing this because this is different from having your passport issued in one of the colonies. It was actually issued in the UK. And then in March 1979, he then went to visit his in-laws. And when I was talking to him during the interview, he said, at the time, something was stamped in his passport, but he hadn't noticed it until many years later. But it said on the passport, subject to immigration control. And this was because St. Lucia had become independent in February 1979. And what I haven't been able to kind of ascertain out of all this as yet is why, if a passport is, how does a passport that is issued in Britain become invalid? I mean, that person is just British. He never had, well, he traveled on his parents' passport, but so he never officially had his own St. Lucian passport. So that's something that I'm still kind of looking into, but I'm totally baffled by. And he traveled to Trinidad to visit his wife's 6 parents. They were there for a period over 2 years. And when he went to the British Embassy there, his passport had expired. When he went to the British Embassy there, they wouldn't give him, well, they said they couldn't help him, that he needed to apply for a St. Lucian passport, essentially, or try and get a Trinidadian passport, which didn't make sense because he's not from Trinidad. I'll play a little bit of this recording, but only primarily to show you the problem with recording via Zoom. I won't play you the full recording because I don't think it comes across particularly clearly, but oops, let me just go back to that. But we'll see, let's see.
My then-in-laws got sick, seriously ill. We decided to travel back to spend some time with them. My wife at that time was extremely close to her parents, right? So we came back down to Trinidad in December of 1983. And because of the health situation of my in-laws, right, at the time when I was in England, right, I was in between jobs. So it wasn't a problem for me to come to Trinidad and stay for an extended period. So we were here, and then what happened was we stayed longer than we had planned because we had no choice in the matter. We stayed with my in-laws. We were there. We were helpful. They were fairly well off at the time, and it wasn't.
So that's giving you a sense of Richard's situation. As I say, I believe he's now very recently, this slide is slightly out of date because he has been told by the Home Office that he can have British citizenship. The only problem now, though, is that he's got children who that citizenship status doesn't apply to, and he doesn't want to leave them behind in Trinidad. So that's another issue. So Glenda Caesar was from, oh gosh, I put that she was born in Grenada in an earlier slide, and that is a mistake. She was actually born in Dominica and left for the UK in 1961 when she was only 3 months old. And again, she'd really wanted to retain some kind of contact with the Republic of Dominica, but she wasn't able to do that. Again, because she basically had problems sorting out her passport status. And in fact, on one journey she made when she returned in 2003, having traveled to the island, when she returned, the customs officer said to her that there were problems with her status, but nevertheless they waved her through. And this kept going on until 2008, when she was given a formal warning by customs. But the really interesting thing, whoops, go back to that. The really interesting thing was actually to do with her employment status. So whereas a lot of the people I'd spoken to had realized there was a problem because they were traveling, a lot of other people that I'd spoken to experienced problems because of their work situation. So this is a recording, I believe this is a recording from when she had issues at work. Oops, keeps doing that.
2009. I had been working, so you know, to get jobs wasn't a problem for me because I had an experience in mental health. I had been working for the NHS for over, like, I think it was maybe 20 years. So I had reached the stage where I'm touching 50 now. So I'm saying, well, I want to sit down now. And, you know, my kids are big. They're going to work. It's time for me to sort of like relax. So I took on a part-time, but I applied for a part-time job in a GP surgery, which wasn't too far away from me. And that, it was literally walking distance, and it was 4 hours a day. And the money was good. I'm not going to lie, it was good for 4 hours a day. I applied as a receptionist, but when I got there, the acting practice manager at the time said, "You're very experienced. We're looking for someone to oversee the receptionist, and we need a GP administrator. Would you take on that role?" I was like, I didn't want. I just come away from responsibility. So, okay. When she explained what I did, I said, "Yeah, I'll do it. It's only 2 receptionists I've got to oversee. I'm quite happy to do that." So that was in January 2009. I took up the position. She was just interim practice administrator. She was happy for me to take the job. Further down the line, a new practice manager came along, and he saw that I hadn't given my passport, and I was like, well, you know, I'm in the job. You can call any of my references. They'll tell you how long I've held my positions, you know, and what positions I've held. No, we need a passport. And I said, well, okay. So I brought my CARICOM passport in to show him where there were stamps in, where I'd travelled, where I'd been in and out of the country. But he wasn't happy with that. He wanted something to say that I had the right to work in England. So I said, well, I've got the right to work in England because I've been working all my life, you know. And I said, I've just sort of like semi-retired and taken this job on this way. Nope, that isn't good enough. We're going to get fined. We'll get this and we'll get that. So I said, okay, phone the Home Office. I'll wait right here for them to come and get me. And he did. He contacted the Home Office and they said, is she in the position? He said, yes. And they said, okay. But he wasn't happy with that. And it was getting to me because it was like a continuous thing every day. He would be going on, he'd be going on. And then I think the partners agreed with him that they were frightened in case they got fined because I wasn't able to work. And on the 6th of November 2009, he dismissed me from my job for gross misconduct. He actually stated in the letter, I can read it to you, the grounds upon which you have been dismissed are gross misconduct, namely any breach of a statute which directly affects your ability to carry out your duties or the characteristics of your position. This relates to your refusal or inability to produce a valid passport with a valid work permit, which is required under the Immigration, Asylum and Nationality 2006 Act. As you are a holder of a passport of the Commonwealth of Dominica, you're required to have a valid work visa. Your current passport, issued on the 25th of August 2008, does not contain a work visa. So that's why I was sacked.
Yeah, so this particular case showed that at least from 2006, so definitely not, you know, when we think of the Windrush scandal, we think of 2013. But in actual fact, everybody, pretty much everybody I've spoken to had problems from at least 2005, some of them from 2000. So clearly there's other pieces of legislation that have been in effect that have been actually marginalizing a lot of members of the community, but went unnoticed. And so to a certain extent, Theresa May's hostile environment kind of exposed that all of these other things were going on. So anyway, so that's how that leads into the project we're currently working on. So we're tracing various strands and looking at the kind of political context, the diplomatic context, the national, local context, and administrative processes. In particular, I guess what we're interested in as well is the difference between policy and practice. So I'm gonna, I won't, I mean, I'm just aware of the time, it's kind of 1 o'clock. So I've been waffling on for quite a long while. Yeah, so we're looking at various different things, but the ultimate aim of the project is to produce 60 major interviews that will be made available in audio form, 30 interviews that really connect to Caribbean politicians and diplomats. And they're going to be, our main interest is in seeing how they related to the community and community activists in order to help place the kind of hostile environment on the political agenda. And yeah, so the other 30 interviews, which are the ones that I'm focusing on, are on the community and the people that have supported them. I guess the main point about the project is to make sure that we are preserving the voices of the community and that the community is saying all of this in their own voices, that they're talking about their experience of the situation, so that we get a strong sense of the human side of policy. You know, what's the impact of policy on human beings? How does it affect them? How does it affect their families? But also not thinking of it just in terms of those who have been victims of the Windrush scandal, but also looking at the amazing way in which the community has come together to support each other and to mitigate the impact of the scandal, but also to put pressure on the government to make changes. So we're creating at the moment a kind of dedicated website that's going to have oral history recordings, actually not just on the website, but also preserved within the Senate House Library. And those recordings are also going to be made available at the British Library, as well as the Black Cultural Archives. And then other colleagues and myself are going to be looking at primary documentation. So it's kind of an oral history project that's supported by archival work. And then the end point is to have this sort of jointly authored monograph. Yeah, and also to do things like have various events, podcasts, road shows. I think one point worth mentioning is that we're looking at producing a special podcast that will have dedicated handouts for use in the teaching of the OCR history GCSE module, Migration to Britain. So we want to be able to have an impact as well on schools and on various other projects. The other thing that I should mention while I'm doing this is that as a project, we're aware that there are lots of different oral histories that have been produced by the community, but that are across the country. And what we're trying to do is kind of identify where they are and bring them together under a kind of centralized catalogue, a composite catalogue, so that people can easily find these recordings and use them for educational purposes. Just very quickly, given the time, I just wanted to talk about some of the current things that we've been looking at. One is the limitations of the term Windrush Generation. I've been speaking to a lot of high-profile elders within the community, and I'm finding that some people feel that using the term Windrush Generation obscures the reality that Black people have been in Britain for hundreds of years. if not going all the way back to Roman times, whereas others are really partial to that, to the term Windrush generation, and feel that it's about a generation that has experienced very specific challenges. So these are things that academics we're going to have to think about how we actually present the project. The other thing is, of course, the Windrush scandal is really quite a problematic term, in the sense that it doesn't make it clear that there are many people who aren't part of that Windrush generation who've been affected. So whether you're from India, Nigeria, Ghana, other members of the Commonwealth, other Commonwealth territories have clearly been impacted as well. So yeah, there's just the kind of questions that we're thinking about. And then meantime as well, other people mentioned to me that I needed to be thinking really far back in terms of the longer history, because some members of the community felt that after the Notting Hill race, well, some people call them race riots. I think it's better to call them the Notting Hill uprisings. Was saying that they felt that the Mental Health Act of 1959 had been brought in as just yet another tool and another way of marginalizing the Black community, of finding ways to repatriate them. And indeed, I spoke to somebody called Agri Burke, who was one of Britain's first Black psychiatrists. And he said that, yes, he had done a lot of research on repatriations to the UK as a result of that, repatriations to the Caribbean as a result of that. And I don't know if you saw, there was an article recently by Kehinde Andrews in the Guardian newspaper, where Burke is quoted as saying, "The idea among my colleagues was that by sending them home to live under the coconut tree or banana tree, they would get better." But his study, he does a study in 1971 and also a later study in 1975, where he actually travels to Jamaica, and he finds indeed that I think on his first trip he found 54 people who'd been repatriated on the basis that they had mental health issues, so that even though they had recovered whilst they were in the UK from their mental health issues, they were still nevertheless told that, you know what, it's better to go back to Jamaica so that, you know, your mental health problems don't come back. And in actual fact, he says that of the 54 people that he found there, he discovered that 6 males and 1 female were dead, 3 from drowning, 1 for an overdose, 1 had died naturally, and 1, the death was undetermined. But he found that most of them had died in isolation from their families. And so likely they were suicides, although they hadn't been recorded in that way. But he also talked about the fact that 2/3 of the survivors were actually showing signs of what he later coins repatriation syndrome, in that they were suffering from kind of mental health issues relating to the stigma of having failed in the migration progress, of having come back to Jamaica and being seen as others of failing in that opportunity, you know, the opportunity of traveling abroad, greater educational and economic success. So in a sense, we're kind of marginalized. But also the reality was that most of these people had families that they'd been, they were now separated from, and who were still based in the UK. And he confirmed the fears of other members of the community when he says that the great majority of the patients in his case study had been admitted to hospital under the compulsory order of the Mental Health Act 1959. So that was that. And then there's other interviews that I've done recently where people have mentioned repatriation schemes, I think that coincided with the period of Enoch Powell, and saying there was a 2-tier system where you could be repatriated and you would have assistance in, I think you'd have your plane fare paid for, but you'd have to pay it back. But also a system whereby the monies you'd paid into the system, the taxes and national insurance, would be paid back. But under those circumstances, you wouldn't be allowed back into the UK. And then somebody else talked about the fact that the that maybe we should broaden the project, because actually a lot of the activism in the 70s and 80s was around protecting South Asians from being deported. And I guess some of you will remember that they had things like virginity tests for South Asian women to see if it was really true that they were coming to get married to their Indian-born husbands, and that sort of thing. So that's something I haven't yet looked into, but is kind of on my radar. And then just recently I spoke to somebody from the Movement for Justice who also pointed out to me that we need to be thinking about the future, not just about the past, in the sense that the people who are currently being having their status regularized under the Windrush Task Force are not actually generally being given British citizenship, that most of the people who are applying under that scheme are being given indefinite leave to remain. And their concern is that the British population are primarily seeing people of the Windrush generation as British, and which members of the Windrush generation themselves see themselves as British. But the problem is they're being given indefinite leave to remain status. And that in itself is a problem because it has an onward impact on their children. So, for example, one of the main things that the Movement for Justice highlighted to me was the fact that their children would then have to naturalize as British or register as British, but you have to still pass the good conduct I guess test. I don't know how you would the good conduct clause maybe, but they were sort of saying that by the age of 10 you've reached the age of criminal responsibility, and so they'd found that even people who'd been expelled from school at the age of 10 weren't then able to apply for British citizenship because their parent had indefinitely leave to remain status, etc. So those are the kinds of issues we're going to have to think about going forward. So whereas previously I was just looking at interviewing people who were part of that kind of Windrush generation and, you know, maybe just an elder from that generation, I'm now looking also at other members of the family and checking what their status is and how that's had a broader impact. And then I just wanted to mention that I've been doing a lot of work at the Oral History Archives in Brixton. You know, a lot of people have already preserved the voices of the Windrush generation, particularly of activists. So one of the things that I came across there was a report by Baroness Ross Howells, and she had said, let me see if I can find what she said, but she basically expressed concern about the fact she was aware from at least 2009 that Jamaicans were being deported. She herself didn't understand why they were being deported, but she thought it was very strange that at the same time as the British were deporting Jamaicans, they were also recruiting soldiers from Jamaica to fight the war in Afghanistan. And that for me was really interesting, because now some of the people who've been applying under the Windrush Task Force are people who fought for a period of 10 years in Afghanistan, believing that they would then be given British citizenship, but are now being denied it. So there's that. And then I just wanted to give you an example of one of the first interviews I've done under the banner of this Windrush Scandal project is this gentleman here, Alexander Prosper. He did an amazing interview, which was really fascinating. And I think one of the things that I was really surprised by is you can see that he's got in one hand a British passport, which is called the Colony of St. Lucia. And he recognized himself that there was a difference between a passport issued in St. Lucia and a passport issued in the UK. So he paid £10, actually £15 in total, to register as British and also to get a British passport. So you see he's holding in his other hand a British passport that was issued in the UK. Sorry, I've just come to the end of that, so I'm just going to come out of stop share. But yeah, his passport was issued in the UK, but But then St. Lucia became independent in 1979, and again he was then told, no, you're no longer British. And so even though you've got a British passport, you registered, you paid for it, you're no longer British, you need to apply for a St. Lucian passport. And so he did that, and the story goes on. I mean, he's literally had problems since around about 1979 to present day. And of course, there's now the inward impact on his family. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a recording with his son, his son, sadly, actually, you may have seen reported in the newspapers, his son, the whole thing went to court because he was trying to get a British passport. It's been thrown out. He's been told he's not eligible for British citizenship. And apparently he's going to have to go through the whole process of proving that he's allowed to live here. Then he's got to apply for indefinite leave to remain, which normally takes like, I don't know, he has to go through like a 5, sometimes 10-year process, then he can apply for British citizenship. So it really shows you that at the moment he can't work. He's not allowed to legally work under those circumstances, even though his father is British, his siblings are British. It's very much an ongoing issue. And I guess the main thing that I've tried to get across, and I'll just re-emphasize that this project is about the experience of Black people. It's about the experience of Caribbean people from their perspective, so that all of us as a nation can get a really strong understanding of the implications of really unfair legislation and the laws. And also, what a waste of life. Why have people, who are British living in Britain, who don't have access, who can't work, who can't contribute, even though they've got all the abilities to contribute in all sorts of myriad ways. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I've gone on for a very long time, but I hope it was an interesting and useful talk. Thank you, Liz.
Well, thank you. It was absolutely riveting, just amazing. Now, Marcia's squeaking with wanting to ask questions and congratulate you on that presentation.
Well, in terms of asking questions, what I really want to say is, wow, amazing. And I'll tell you what I'm very impressed with, Dr. Junita Cox, is the fact that you've done this research and now you're going to do something with the research that you've done. And what you'll be doing is literally turning the tide in terms of government policies, procedures. It's massive. That's the end game bit I love. Brilliant.
Thank you, Marcia. Yeah, no, that's always been one of my frustrations about academia, is like, why do this work if it's not going to then have an onward impact on the community? So I think the whole premise of this is, well, there's one thing is that we need to preserve the history and the experience of the Black community, but we also need to make sure that this is going to have an onward impact, even if it's just about shaming the government in a sense. I mean, it's not that I'm going out to necessarily shame them, but if that's what the evidence shows, then that is what will be there.
Well, the thing with this shaming them, it's not even so much shaming them, it's blatantly obvious. Yeah. That's why this is so frustrating. You wouldn't even need to be academic to understand and follow your narrative. You can see that it's so blatantly obvious. It's disgusting.
No, exactly. And also just because, I've spoken to, I can't tell you how many lawyers I've spoken to about this, and everybody's confused. Like, no one can work out. If you've registered as British, the only passport you've got is a British passport. How can someone decide you're no longer British? It just is insane, and so yeah, and also just the other things that like with Anthony Brown having been out of the country for 2 years in Jamaica, but there were different clauses that didn't affect different territories, and Jamaica was one of the territories where you were allowed outside of the country for more than 2 years, and it shouldn't have affected their status. So it's things like, it was just things like the law is so complex. That on the one hand, there's the law, nobody really understanding it. And so what is the impact of that on practice is that everybody's being treated in all kinds of myriad crazy ways. you know, and just the sadness too I felt of people who had really trusted in the British, you know, particularly when you think of that generation and they've come to the motherland and they believe in the you know, in the British as being these honorable kind of, you know, especially this whole thing of honor, you know, and then now being really disillusioned and yeah, tricked, you know. Yeah. Yeah. No, I like your comment there, Marcy, about could you be involved in the teaching aspect of the GCSE? Just to say, this project is as inclusive as it can be, and anyone who's interested in contributing in any way is more than welcome to be part of it. You know, if I can find a way of getting the community to help, that's fantastic. And of course, everybody will be acknowledged in the process, because I really want it to be a community-driven project anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, that would be easy to happen because there's already literature and teaching resources out there about this subject. Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, David wanted to make a point.
Yes, thanks, Juanita. Something I've been reading recently, and I just was wondering if it was something you'd used, is Michael Dummett's book on immigration and refugees. Michael Dummett was professor of logic at Oxford University, and his wife, Anne Dummett, published in the 1970s a portrait of English racism. And Michael Dummett's book is 30 years later, in 2001. And and as professor of logic, I think one of the things that it comes forward incredibly strongly from it is the illogicality of what was happening in that period. Something that I think also both of them mention in their books also is, and I think they're certainly at the beginning of their campaigning, it was a period where there was more discretion with immigration officers, but they believed that racism had become embedded in the immigration service. And I wondered if any things were coming up from the oral history you're doing about not just the experience of the system, but the experience of immigration officers, and if that was part of the trauma of the experience.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, David, and very much so. And in fact, one of the things I think is really interesting, that's harder to kind of identify, but definitely there, is the informal ways that they try to keep people out. And as you say, a lot of the immigration officers have the power to decide who could come in and who couldn't come in. What we've come across so far is people who've said that immigration officers would say things like, I'm not sure about your mental stability, or that kind of, they've just come up with all sorts of random excuses, and therefore wouldn't let people come in to the country. So I have a colleague whose name is Dr. Eve Hayes de Calaf, who's going to be traveling to Jamaica, Barbados, and a few other islands to actually do interviews with people who've been stuck overseas, and to get that kind of capture those kinds of stories. But definitely, yeah, it's harder to try and, because people's memories, well, first of all, the vast majority of people who've been affected by the scandal are people that have never traveled. So, and they're people who, because they've never traveled, never needed a passport. So maybe it doesn't affect them so much. So most of the information that we would have would be from people who are based in the Caribbean, which I haven't done yet. But yeah, definitely is a really interesting aspect of the study. And thanks for mentioning the book as well about Michael Dummett. I've read one of his books, but I don't think that, well, they're not the one from 2001. That sounds like
right, yes, yeah. It's, yeah, so on immigration and refugees.
And refugees, okay.
I mean, he was arguing for a policy of open borders.
Yeah.
So it was coming at it from as a moral case. He thought that was a
no, and
responsibility.
I think that's one of the things, because, for example, in the case of Alexander Prosper, the gentleman from St. Lucia, who's only just got his British citizenship, they're being very rigid about things like, so his son arrived in the UK 2 months after 2 months after he'd reached adulthood. So he was 18 years old in 2 months, that was it. And because he arrived as an adult, he doesn't qualify for British citizenship. You know, he can't get it through his father, he has to get it through his own right. And it's that kind of thing that we're saying is utterly ridiculous, because his entire family are here, they're British, but because they're not being flexible, it's this kind of thing where families are being separated, which is a huge problem. But yeah, the rigidity of the law is a major issue, I think, as well.
Certainly given us lots to think about, and I've just been writing a funding application to look at what we might be able to do to raise awareness over the Windrush Day recognition. So it's given me something to think about. So Marcia, I ought to talk to you in a bit. Okay, well, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. So much detail, but you explained so clearly. That's really lovely. And I think next week, Bunmi, you're going, Bunmi Oye-san, Dr. Bunmi Oye-san, who's been joining us on and off today. I think she's going to join us next week. Now, she'll be joining us from Canada, and she'll be telling us about her latest initiative, which is about African children's stories. So that should be really good. Thank you very much again then, Juanita. That's really brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll stop the recording now.